I've got this just feeling that there's more conflict today than there was before. That could be completely off. I don't know. Are you seeing more conflict, or has it just always been there?
It's always been there. It just is. I think the news makes us feel like there's more conflict. I think it's that it's front and center. People want to approach conflict now, or address it or manage it, rather than run from it and avoid it.
Who honestly can say right now they don't have some kind of conflict in their life? We all have conflict. And I would argue, with the end of the pandemic and our move into different kind of work styles and workplaces and work relationships, conflict is probably more present now than ever. So I am so thrilled to have on our show today, Leslie Nydick. Leslie Nydick is the Conflict Strategist. She is fantastic at just giving really simple, practical tips on not only how to deal with and address certain conflicts, which we'll talk about on the show, but also some great tips and pointers on how to avoid it in the first place. As I usually do, I took a whole ton of notes, listened real close to her particular practical tips, and when we end the show today, I'm going to share with you the highlights that I had. But the big takeaway is, with this show, you're going to really learn how to manage conflict a whole lot better. Well, Leslie, I am so excited to have you on the show here today to talk about such an important topic of conflict. I mean, I can't imagine a more important time to talk about conflict when we have conflict in our work life, we have conflict in our personal life, we have conflict when we're now trying to navigate the roads after the pandemic. It just seems like there's conflict at every single turn. So thank you for coming on the show.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we jump into our topic and learn from you on some of the best ways we can manage this, tell us a little bit about you. I'd be curious about for the listeners that don't know the work you do, share a little bit about the work you do, and then how did you even get into this work in the first place?
Sure. And that is a question many have. So what I do is I mediate, I arbitrate, I teach, and I train in conflict management. How I got here was that my career started in real estate, facilities management, design, and construction. I did that in the public sector as well as the private sector, in every industry you can think of, even including Radio City Music Hall.
Wow.
I found myself, especially on construction sites, in the middle of problems, challenges, and essentially conflict every day. And when I was at a point where I was deciding what was my next step in my career, I had always wanted to be out on my own. And I asked myself all those questions you're supposed to ask, hey, what am I good at? What do I love doing? What do I still want to learn and do? It all always came back to negotiation and conflict management. So I had been doing it. And then I was like, let's just focus on that. And that's where I am.
Wow. So now when you think about your world today, you mentioned all those things: arbitration, mediation, teach on conflict. Is it always in the workplace, or is it also kind of bleed outside the workplace? Tell us a little bit more about kind of the scope of your work.
Yeah, I think at the moment, mostly focusing on workplace related. But there's always a but. Arbitration, I do that for the stock exchanges. So a lot of times that's cases between customers and brokers. It may be between the employer and the employees, or sometimes employers and employers, disputes about sharing of accounts and things like that. But I'm finding the focus in the workplace, although I've focused in the family. I did part of my work has also been in guardianship court, working with elders and families and allegedly incapacitated people, and managing, as you can imagine, the conflict with all the relatives and family members and everyone who thinks they know what's best for the elder. So wide range, but my focus primarily now is workplace.
So I've got this just feeling that there's more conflict today than there was before. That could be completely off. I don't know. Are you seeing more conflict, or has it just always been there?
It's always been there. It just is. I think the news makes us feel like there's more conflict. I think it's that it's front and center. People want to approach conflict now, or address it or manage it, rather than run from it and avoid it. I think that during the pandemic, as people were at home, and it gives you more of a chance to think about like what you're enjoying about your workplace, your work, what you don't like about it, they would actually start talking about the conflict rather than running from it. I think that the being remote gave us a chance to start talking about it, like, hey, I want to deal with it. Same thing with the specific topic of like toxic workplaces and bullying. I've had people approach me going, wow, it's just on the increase. I'm like, no, it's that people are talking about it now. They want to address it. They don't want to go back to that workplace and deal with that toxic environment or the bully. They want it managed and addressed. So that's why I think it feels like there's more of it. It's just that now everyone wants the answer of like, how am I going to manage this? Such
an excellent point. I think you're so right. That our 2 years semi-sabbatical of a regular work life has got everybody reflecting on what really is important to me. Do I really want to be working with people? Would I rather be working at home? Do I want more money? Do I want more flexibility? Do I want to have ability to, work wherever I want? I mean, all those sorts of questions. And so they're bringing that more front and center and having those conversations. I just, what a great point. I'd never thought of it that way. So maybe let's just take one of those. I know a common one. I've actually got a show coming up where I actually interview my son. He's a 17-year-old. He works at Jersey Mike's. He's a shift manager, and a lot of the challenges is getting paid fairly. And so when you think about employees and they're thinking about, gosh, I don't feel like I'm getting paid fairly. I could make a lot more money if I leave. That's a form of conflict. Any tips and recommendations on how you have those conversations, how you start that path of trying to find a healthy compensation or healthy balance to kind of make it work for everybody?
Well, I think, and what's actually personally worked for me, is that the conversation can't just be like at that moment when you're at the end of your rope, like I'm going to leave because I'm not getting enough money. I think it's something you have to work on throughout your career. And there's a piece of advice I got from my parents when I was very young, and it really has just become my habit, that it's things like keeping your resume up to date always, the moment you start a new job, and doing it all the time. And also keeping that list of successes. You might not share it and send it out to your boss, but keeping that list and figuring out ways to promote what you do and share it with others, because I think a lot of us sit back and assume that everyone's observing us and they're going to pay us what we deserve because of all the great things we did. But we have to actually proactively manage that, because our managers and supervisors are dealing with the same issue, that they're wanting the more money and they want to make sure they're paid for every success. So they're not really observing everything you're doing and keeping track of it. So I think it's like an ongoing conversation, so that it's not like that in the moment, like, hey, I need more money or I'm leaving.
Beautiful. So I'm curious I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. It's this fine balance of not acting too comfortable. I mean, you don't want to say, well, I'd love to get more money, but I understand you've got constraints and you just whatever works for you. That's one extreme. The other extreme is you have until Friday to make a decision or I quit. I mean, that's another extreme. How do you create the right balance of urgency or intensity around that, but not put too much pressure on it?
Well, I mean, sometimes you need the pressure on.
Okay.
But know that you're going to it can't be an empty threat. That's how if you really want to leave, if you don't get it, then it's okay to say that. But do not say it if you're not ready to leave. I had that experience. There was one time, and Plus, it wasn't a long-term employer. My employer was already bankrupt. However, I knew I had a few more years with them because at the time I was running real estate and I needed to get rid of all of it for them during this bankruptcy process. But I was not being paid enough to do what was involved. And I did. I showed all the information, the industry, other similar positions, what people were being paid, what revenue they were getting from all the work I was doing. And I said, if you don't resolve this in the next month, I will be going for another job. But I meant it. And I was going to move on. I would have never threatened that if I had not been able to know that I would have walked away. But if you're at that desperation point, is the money enough? I asked myself that too. Like, it's not just the money. I've often asked for other things, not just the money, because I'll look at the budget and go, you know what? I know it's January. They're not going to all of a sudden give me more money and fight for a bigger budget for me. But what can I get that might not be like specific money out of their pocket, so to speak? Everything from conferences I wanted to go to on my own, but I was going to be using vacation time for my personal growth. Hey, can we not count this as vacation? Those are some of the creative things to think about. Of course, it depends on the situation, but think of all those benefits you can just kind of add in that won't cost someone money.
So I'm going to go down that path a little bit. So now one of the big ones that everyone's wanting to negotiate is flexible work schedules or flexible presence in the office. Mm-hmm. And so how do you balance that? There's been cases where, particularly when people are paid a certain standard of living to live in more expensive regions of the United States, like New York City or San Francisco, and then, then they want to still have that same salary, but they want to then move to a less expensive place. So that creates some tension. If you are an employee and you are employed by one of these places, but you want to continue to have a flexible work situation, how might you consider some of those trade-offs and how to have that conversation?
Before having the conversation, figure out what you really want rather than just kind of getting on this train where everyone's saying, oh, I want to work remote all the time. Make sure that's what you really want, because I think there's many people who don't really want to work remote all the time. Figure out what kind of balance you want. And even for your job and your company, does it make sense for you to be remote every single day and all the time? So figure out what a more ideal equation would be. Of course, go back to the pandemic and look at, hey, what has been working? Why has it been working well? Because you've had time to think on your own. You've had that private time rather than being in that big fishbowl of the office where there never is thinking time. What would be a better balance? When you have all that information, I think it becomes a different conversation, because it starts with hey, we know what's worked well during the last 2 years. Now, some of it's going to change because we're not all going to be remote, but some of that remote time we need to keep, because this and this have not only happened during that time, but we've done better with it.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. So I'm going to pivot. I want to now talk about toxic coworkers or bosses. Okay. So let's say we find ourselves, and I know these are probably different situations, but I'll let you kind of choose your own adventure on this one, Leslie. Let's say we find ourselves either with a toxic coworker that's just really difficult to work with. Maybe there's just some real challenges there they're causing problems for us, or we find ourselves with a toxic boss that's just very, very difficult. But what are some recourses or avenues we can take to try and resolve that conflict?
So first, before determining that person is toxic, or even to the extent of being a bully, start really looking at and reflecting on the conversations and communication that's going on between the two of you. For instance, on the written side, I've seen this way too many times where I'm told, oh, we're in a toxic work culture. Look at all these emails I have that shows you. And I read them and go, why don't you read them out loud to me of how you hear this email?
Oh, interesting.
And then I'll read the email out loud. And then we see the disconnect that because there were some feelings towards this person, what they read is very different than what was the voice the person wrote it in.
So the person might write something like fine, with the word just fine, but we could interpret it as fine or fine, right? It's but just the word fine.
And you picked on a perfect word that I personally have a hot button about, and I know it and I recognize it. There was a way my mom said fine that you knew things were not fine. So when I hear someone go fine or even write fine, I'm like, well, it's not fine, is it? And I check in on that one. So the knowing what voice someone was using when they were writing something is impossible to know without asking them. And one way I combat that is that if I receive an email from someone that I'm just seeing negative intent in it, I'll just call up and get in a conversation like, oh, you know what? I didn't get a chance to read that whole email because there's a problem with my computer or phone or whatever. Could tell me what you needed. When I hear it, now I'm getting the more accurate tone versus what I put into it.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the verbal, that maybe we're assuming that this person is toxic because of the way we've heard them talk to us, the way they've behaved. First, assume positive intent. Just give that benefit of the doubt to everyone, and then start listening to the content and not always the behavior, because we're all different in the way we talk. And I'm not trying to say that there isn't toxicity in
Sure.
a workplace. I'm just trying to weave through it because it's not all toxic that can't be managed.
I think that's beautiful. I love that. And I think that's so true. Immediately, I'm thinking about when that becomes even more challenging and more relevant when people move up higher in organizations because they lead a function that is naturally in tension with another function.
Yes.
Like I think about all organizations like a car. Some functions are brake pedal functions, some functions are gas pedal functions. And you need them both to navigate those turns. And if you're all gas pedal, you go off the cliff. And if you're all brake pedal, you never leave the parking spot. So finance and marketing are always going to be in tension, right? Marketing says, let's spend more money. And finance says, whoa, no spending. We need to keep our spending down to zero. And then that creates natural tension. And so it's easy for those leaders to say, I don't like Sandra in finance. She always tells me no. But that's just kind of Sandra's job. And so sometimes you can misinterpret it. I love your idea of assuming positive intent. Sandra's just trying to do the best for the company.
I was that person who always had to say no because I was managing this asset where it wasn't our core business, the real estate. But yet between real estate and our employees, we were the two biggest costs in the company. And it was always immediate that people were like, oh, Leslie, we need more space. We need a new, building, whatever. And I, of course it's first, no, let's look at it and figure out what we can do. So there was always tension and conflict immediately. I was in a company that grew huge. We started 100 employees when I got there, and then we grew to over 5,000.
Wow.
And there were a lot of silos. And I was talking to the president once, and I go, oh, you know what? One of those next big rah-rah events that we have where we all get together, could we figure out a way to get everyone to get along? And he's like, what do you mean? And it was what you described. Like, of course, finance is struggling, has tension with certain departments because they're always saying no. And he's like, oh, no. I love that tension. I love the organized chaos. I want the silos to all be competing with each other. So that was our company culture. It was a bit, I thought it was toxic. And then when I listened to him, I realized he loved that. He thought tension was good. It created competition. So it's all mindset.
Yeah. I've heard a leader say in his organization, I'm trying to create a state of constant professional discomfort, which can be valuable in many ways. So I want to now pivot a little bit more to the other example. Let's say my leader, the person that I'm supporting, it's not going well. And maybe there are clear signs. So it's the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial is, taking up a lot of media attention, and that's just been an absolute mess. But we're seeing those kinds of emails and interactions, and it's just really nasty and unpleasant. Where would you take, if you're an employee, what are some of your options in terms of trying to resolve that situation with your leader?
I think if everything has been tried, some of the things I said, like, is there assume positive intent and try to explore that. Try to manage it, try to figure out. I had a boss that everyone thought was like horribly toxic. And the more I really just observed as a non-involved, I tried to not involve myself. I realized that there was this insecurity. I'm like, maybe I need to recognize that and manage it. And it did reduce the toxic culture, not completely, because there was still some bullying. And honestly, there are times you just have to report it. Because if they're a bully, a narcissist, they're not necessarily going to change. And you're not supposed to work in this kind of work culture. Your employers are supposed to provide not just a safe physical environment, but a safe emotional environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say you're not the only coworker that's dealing with this boss. Is there any advantage of going together to HR as a group versus individually, or does it really matter?
Oh, I think it matters. I've seen that type of boss be removed, it was because the group got together and went and reported, and depending on the organization, the ones I've been in, it wasn't reported to HR. It was reported to, they skipped a level and went above the boss. And they were successful. I saw 2 different times where that kind of bullying, narcissistic boss who was never going to change, and the history was there from all the prior companies, but they were involved in bringing in revenue. And that has always been my experience, that when there are some real bullies and real narcissists that are managing departments and divisions and companies, that they're bringing in that revenue, and that's why it's forgiven.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's overlooked, but then you look at their history, and it's much more than us just being uncomfortable. Severe harassment is going on.
Yeah. So something else that I know we were getting ready for the show that you've mentioned and talked about, but I'd love to learn more. Tell us more about proximity bias.
Yes. So before we called hybrid teams hybrid, I was on some of these teams very early in my career, where it wasn't necessarily remote working at home. It was remote that I was in a completely different location than my team, than my boss. And clearly, those who are nearby, the traditional way of a team operating, have advantages, opportunities. They're around for those, hey, everyone, I just got out of a big meeting. Let me tell you what happened. And the one who's remote will get that email later on in the day going, oh, Leslie, this morning we talked about this, this, and this. Just want to let you know. Well, that's a real disconnect, because I'm just getting like that little summary versus being there for the energy, the excitement. Hey, what does this mean for us? And that's where the bias comes in, that you're not nearby. So whether you're the manager or the team member, it takes a lot of extra being proactive, intention. If you're the manager, I think you have to think of the remote people first, because you have to overcome that distance, that they're not there for those informal chats, those informal conversations that we don't schedule. You know, all that passing by each other, you meet up at the elevator. I mean, some of my best creative conversations and innovations came from like those, like walking by someone's desk going, oh, I just heard you talking to someone. I didn't know you were working on such and such. Do you know I'm working on that? Like, our departments kind of intersect. Maybe we should collaborate. That's harder to come by when you're remote, because you miss out on all that informal brainstorming.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. So that segues me to our last official question, because we're actually getting close on time already. So any tips you might have for us on how we can prevent conflict? What are some things we can do in the front end to try and prevent these kinds of bumpy things from occurring?
Sure. So I would say there's 3 or 4, like I call, like they're my power tools. The one is increased awareness that we interpret and perceive words and phrases differently, even when we think the definitions are absolute. And I'm just going to throw out one that I know is a common one for all of us. Like when someone says, I'll call you later. When is later? Like tomorrow, in a few minutes, next month? But those kind of words we throw out there without clarification. So my thing is, if we use those words when it's important, make sure we clarify and say what we really want, state our expectations. The other things, and I know that you've talked about this, listening, active listening. We have to, there's some stats that I think just portray the issue, that we can talk at an average of 125 to 200 words per minute, but we have the ability to listen at 400 to 700 words per minute.
Wow.
That gap we often fill up with like planning what we're going to say next, or even like writing our shopping list of things we need to buy on the way home. If we keep that space empty just to listen, there'll be a lot better communication going on. And I would say the real power tool for conflict managers, but also helping prevent things from escalating, is the way we ask questions. Most people will ask what I call closed and leading questions. They include like judgment already or assumptions. And what we have to do much more of is ask open questions like, hey, what's happening?
I had a leader that
I
was observing with this leader's team, and there was a little bit of tension and conflict on the team, just to be honest. And the leader would talk for a long time, and then he would end with, "Can't we all agree on that? Can't we all agree?" But there really wasn't. There was no one's going to say no. We can't agree to this. So they just kind of sat there quietly, and he would just say, he would assume that meant agreement. But it was the way he asked that question, which really was so closed and so definitive, although it sounded like it was an invitation. It wasn't.
Right. So, and that's that you just said it, the key. Like our questions have to be invitations, not just us thinking they're invitations. And I think in this, I mean, the pandemic, I think has highlighted why the next thing is so important, checking in with people. And I mean, like, not the how are you, which always gets a robotic response, whether it's fine, good, okay.
You just use fine again, by the way, Leslie. You use fine again. You just use fine again.
Yeah, yes. And that's the issue. Checking, but we have to check in with everyone. Like there's the chatty people, there's the happy people, there's the quiet people. what we're observing really can be deceiving us, that things are not okay. And we have to find ways to check in with people, just like, hey, what's been working well? Hey, what are your challenges this week? How can I support you? What do you need? And again, it's using those open questions, but in a different way where I think people, it's more the invitation that they know you really want to hear an answer and not just, okay, fine, great.
Yeah, beautiful. Leslie, this was great. I mean, such a rich conversation of how to deal with some real challenges we're facing today, how to prevent a lot of stuff from even occurring in the first place as we're all trying to figure out whatever this new normal is going to be for us. So I ask all my guests on the Workplace Therapist Show this question. What is one life hack you have for us for how we can live a life more free of dysfunction, either personally or professionally?
Well, I think this one's personal and professional, and I have been very deliberate about it during the pandemic when I think the boundary of work just kind of disappears. So every night I look at what I have planned for the next day, and I carve out at least a half hour, often an hour, and I write down what it's going to be. It's either going to be a video call with a friend, going out in the morning and getting like my favorite special coffee, or going out for ice cream. That one gets repeated quite often. And I put it on the schedule, and it's a requirement. It doesn't change. If someone wants an appointment during that time, no. It has to happen. And you know what? Then it just makes it that every day has something special, and hopefully a few special things.
I think that's fantastic. Fantastic. So if people want to learn more about you, follow you, and just get more connected to the kind of work you're doing, where can they go?
Oh, well, please, like LinkedIn. I post a few times a week. I talk about conflict management, negotiation, communication, workplace culture, and more. So it's LinkedIn, Leslie Nydick. Please follow or connect with me. And also my website, it's theconflictstrategist.com.
Beautiful.
I post a blog called The Strats. And those are my bite-sized strategies, which are things that are not easy, but straightforward to implement, manage conflict, and improve communication. And I just love sharing it because they're all doable. And that's why I get so excited about sharing the blog.
Leslie, this is great. Theconflictstrategist.com. Beautiful. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Leslie. And what I've loved about it is just you've had a smile the entire time. So we were talking about conflict and you're coming into it with such a positive attitude of resolution, which I think is also a good reminder for us that, don't. Sometimes the more we put on our armor and our weapons, we're almost inviting more of it. So I can see why your just presence in the world helps people to kind of drop a little bit more of their armor and weapons and feel a little more comfortable reaching some kind of agreement. So thank you for all the great work you do. Thank you for you. And thank you for coming on the show today. I've really appreciated it.
And thank you. I mean, I clearly believe that conflict is opportunity, and I hope to be the guide to help others see that. But thank you. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Didn't you find that show helpful? I found it so insightful and enlightening. Some of it was ideas that we've talked about before on the show that Leslie put in a new context and framed. And then others were just some new approaches and thoughts about today. The big thought that I thought was so critical about today was I asked her the question, Leslie, is there more conflict today? She said, no, it's always been there. We're just more open and willing to deal with it today. We've kind of had enough, or we've just made decisions over the pandemic on how we want to live our life. So rather than just tolerating a workplace or work situation, we're actually coming to the table and saying, you know what, I'd like to change that. So we talked about some ways to do that. We talked about how to first manage conflict if you've got a challenge around your compensation. And she reminded us, always keep that up-to-date resume, always have a recording of your wins and successes, and keep that conversation going so you're not waiting to the end and blowing up. We talked about how to deal with toxic coworkers. And she said, first thing is check yourself. Make sure that when you're reading those emails, you're not putting into those emails and interpreting those emails with an emotion that's not there. So she said, really do that. And another way to short circuit that conflict is just, if you see that email and it triggers you, just pick up the phone and call the person. And then finally, we talked about conflict with the boss. What do we do there? Similar things, kind of assume that positive intent. Look for those insecurities, which I thought was so smart, and try and help to ease those insecurities. That might lessen the conflict, but if it does reach a certain level and you have other colleagues dealing with the same issue, report it as a group. Either go to their leader or HR, but go as a group. That's going to have a lot more power and weight. And then finally, I asked Leslie, I said, what are some ways that we can prevent it? She gave a whole list. I'm not going to hit all of them, but some of my all-time favorites you've heard me talk about in the past are clarify expectations so folks aren't guessing. Really, really important. And also making sure that we are really asking questions in a way that's more of an invitation rather than either a judgment statement or closes off. So we're really creating those questions that are invitations to open up dialogue and conversation. There was a lot more there. I'm sure you have your own unique takeaways. The most important thing is you got something out of the show today you can put in play to reduce conflict and make your life that much healthier.